Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I grew up in a quiet, desolate part of Arizona, just outside the Navajo reservation. The kind of place where the nights stretched long and dark, and the silence could be suffocating. We didn't have many neighbors, just miles of open land, scattered clusters of trees, and old barns that had been abandoned long before I was born. It was the kind of place where you could hear everything at night. The wind cutting through the brush, the coyotes howling in the distance, and sometimes things that shouldn't be there. I was 16 the summer it happened. My parents had left for the weekend to visit my grandmother, leaving me alone with our dog, Rusty. He was a mutt, part German Shepherd, part something else, but he was big, smart, and loyal. I never felt unsafe when Rusty was around. If anything, I liked the solitude. A quiet house, a few horror movies, maybe sneak a couple of my dad's beers. Just a typical teenager left to his own devices. That night, around midnight, I let Rusty out in the backyard. I stood on the porch, arms crossed over my chest, watching him disappear into the darkness. The air was still, but something felt off. You ever get that feeling? Like someone's watching you, even when you know you're alone. I heard rustling from the side of the house. Not the wind. Something heavier. Slow. I turned my head sharply, my pulse hammering in my ears. But there was nothing there. Just the trees swaying lazily in the breeze. Just the empty night. Then Rusty barked. Not his usual bark. This one was sharp, urgent. A warning. Then silence. I waited, listening. The kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. Rusty, I called. Nothing. A slow, creeping unease started to work its way up my spine. I grabbed the flashlight from the porch railing and stepped in the yard, sweeping the beam across the grass. It caught on the old wooden fence, the empty lawn chairs, the outline of our shed. But no Rusty. "Come on, boy," I whistled. Then I heard it, a low growl, but it wasn't coming from where Rusty had gone. It came from behind me, from the porch. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. Rusty was there, standing at the top of the steps, staring at me. But something was wrong. His eyes caught the beam of my flashlight and reflected back too bright. Like an animal's in the dark, but more. Almost like they were glowing. And then he moved. Slowly, too slowly. He rose. Not like a dog standing up on its hind legs. No. He unfolded, his limbs twisting, his body jerking in a way that was completely unnatural. And then he spoke. "Let me in." The voice was almost right. Almost Rusty, but there was something underneath it, something too deep, too hollow. I felt my stomach drop, my fingers clenched around the flashlight, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Rusty, or what I thought was Rusty, tilted his head at an unnatural angle, like a broken doll. His mouth pulled back into something that resembled a grin, teeth too white in the dark. "Let me in," he said again. I stumbled back. My chest was tight, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't Rusty. This wasn't Rusty. Then it took a step forward. I turned and bolted. I don't even remember getting inside the house. One second I was in the yard. The next I was slamming the door shut and locking every bolt, my hands shaking so hard I could barely turn the key. The porch creaked. Slow, heavy, then scratching. Long, deliberate scratches against the wood of the door. And then the whispering started. Let me in. Over and over. In that voice. I shoved myself into my bedroom, crawled under the blankets like a child, and squeezed my eyes shut. The whispering didn't stop. Hours passed. My mind ran through every terrifying possibility, but I didn't dare open the door. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have passed out because when I opened my eyes, sunlight was spilling through my window. For a long time, I just lay there listening. Nothing. No scratching. No whispering. Just the distant chirping of birds. The wind through the trees. Finally, I forced myself to move. The house was quiet. The front door was still locked. No scratches. No signs that anything had been there. I hesitated before opening it. Rusty was in the yard, wagging his tail, looking completely normal, like nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard, and I never let Rusty out alone at night again. Story 2. I've been a tow truck driver for over 15 years. I've pulled wrecks out of ravines, flipped rolled over semis, and towed abandoned cars from places where they shouldn't have been in the first place. I've seen a lot of things on these empty roads, things I can't always explain. But what I saw last October, that was something I'll never forget. It was a little past 2 in the morning when I got the call. A stranded vehicle on a stretch of highway about 20 miles outside of town. The driver, some guy in his mid-20s, said they'd hit something, but when they pulled over, there was no sign of damage. Then, their engine just died. Wouldn't start back up. Now, this wasn't unusual. People freak themselves out all the time. Your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere. Your mind starts playing tricks on you. I figured I'd roll up, jumpstart the engine, and be home in an hour. When I arrived, I spotted them right away. A black sedan parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing weakly. The couple stood beside it, illuminated in the cold glow of my truck's headlights. The girl was crying, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to disappear inside her own body. The guy looked worse, shaking, pale. I swear, I saw something, he said as I stepped out. It wasn't a deer. I nodded. I'd heard it before. Could have been a coyote, I said. They get bold sometimes, jump in front of cars. He shook his head. No, he said. It was standing up. That gave me pause. I glanced at the woman. She was still crying, staring at the ground like she didn't want to be part of the conversation. I sighed, figuring they were just worked up. All right, I said, grabbing my flashlight. Let me check under the car. I knelt down, angling the light toward the undercarriage. And that's when I saw them. The scratches. Deep gouges, running in parallel lines along the metal. Long, jagged, claw marks. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I've seen animals scratch up vehicles before, but these were different. Too deep, too deliberate. And they weren't random. Whatever had done this had raked its claws across the car like it was trying to dig through the metal. That's when I heard it. A scraping sound, coming from the ditch beside the road. Slow, deliberate, like something was dragging itself across the gravel. I turned my light toward the source of the noise, and that's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a man, someone injured, maybe crawling his way up the embankment. But the longer I looked, the less human he seemed. His limbs were too long, his movements too jerky, like his bones didn't fit together the way they should. His skin was the color of old wax, stretched too tight over a frame that was all wrong. His fingers were long, gnarled, tipped with claws that scraped against the rocks as he pulled himself forward. Then he lifted his head, and I saw his face. His mouth was too wide, stretched into a grin that split his face from ear to ear. His teeth, God, his teeth were sharp and uneven, like broken glass shoved into his gums. And his eyes, they were solid black, no whites, no pupils, just two empty voids. And then he spoke. Help me. The words were wrong. They came out crackled, distorted, like a voice played through a broken speaker. The girl let out a strangled sob. The guy took a step back, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the woman and shoved her toward my truck. Get in. The guy just stood there, frozen, his eyes locked on the thing in the ditch. I had to grab his arm and yank him toward the truck. Move. We barely got the door shut before the thing started laughing. It was the worst sound I've ever heard. High-pitched, unnatural, echoing through the empty highway like the wind screaming through dead trees. It threw its head back, shoulders shaking with each terrible burst of laughter. Then it started crawling faster, moving in jerky, unnatural lurches. I floored it. We left their car behind, hazard lights still flashing in the darkness. I didn't stop, not until we were miles down the road, the glow of civilization creeping over the horizon. When I finally pulled over, the guy was shaking so hard he could barely get his seatbelt off. The girl was still crying, whispering to herself over and over. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. But it was real. And the next day, the car was gone. No report of it being towed. No trace of the couple ever being there. I checked with the police, the highway patrol. Nothing. It was like that car and everything that happened that night had been erased. But I know what I saw, and I will never stop watching my mirrors on that road again. Story 3. I grew up on a farm in Utah. It was peaceful mostly. The kind of place where the wind carried the scent of dry earth and fresh hay. Where the nights were so quiet you could hear the distant howl of coyotes on the ridge. It was home, but there was one place I never liked. The cornfield. The field stretched for acres behind our house, rows upon rows of tall, whispering stalks that swayed even when there was no wind. It was my grandfather who warned me about it. Never go near the cornfield after dark, he said. Not if you want to stay safe. I was a kid then, maybe 10 or 11. I'd ask him why, but he'd just shake his head and say, the corn remembers things, and it don't forget. It sounded like nonsense, just an old man trying to scare me. So I ignored it, until the night I found out the truth. I was 17 when the killing started. It began with the chickens. At first, we thought it was coyotes, common enough around here. But it wasn't just 1 or 2 chickens gone missing. We'd find them, or what was left of them, torn apart in the dirt, their bodies shredded like something had played with them before killing them. Then it was the barn cats, then a calf. My father set traps. My mother burned sage by the porch, muttering under her breath like she was saying a prayer. My grandfather just stared out at the cornfield with that 1,000-yard gaze of his, the way men who've seen war sometimes do. Then one night I saw it. I was sitting on the back porch, my rifle resting across my lap. My parents were asleep. My grandfather was long gone by then, 2 years in the ground, a heart attack taking him one cold November morning. I should have gone inside, should have locked the doors and shut the blinds, but I was stubborn, and I was curious. The night was still. Not a single coyote howled. The crickets had gone silent. Even the wind had died. And then I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow. A tall, thin figure stood at the edge of the cornfield, right where the moonlight barely touched. It didn't move at first, just stood there, too still, too stiff, like a dead thing propped up on sticks. Then its head jerked toward me. My stomach clenched. Its eyes were glowing, not like the way an animal's eyes catch the light. This was different. These eyes burned, two yellow coals in the darkness, staring straight at me. My breath hitched. My hands went clammy against the rifle. I don't know what made me speak, but I did. Maybe it was the fear, or maybe some dumb teenage bravado. But I gripped my gun and called out, "Hey, get off our property." It didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even breathe. It just stared, and then, in a voice I knew too well, it spoke. "Come here, boy." I nearly dropped the gun, because that voice, it was my grandfather's, exactly the way I remembered it. That gravelly drawl, slow and steady like he was telling me a bedtime story. But my grandfather was dead. I had seen him in his casket, his face pale and waxy, his hands folded over his chest. I had watched as they lowered him into the ground. My skin went cold. I took a step back toward the house. The thing took a step forward. I didn't see its legs move. It was just suddenly closer, like the space between us had shrunk in an instant. Then it darted into the cornfield. I've never seen anything move like that. It was wrong, too fast, too smooth, like it wasn't running but gliding through the stalks. The sound of rustling leaves filled the air, circling me, closing in. I lifted the rifle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip. Then the whispering started. A dozen voices, maybe more, all calling my name. Some were soft, almost gentle. Others were mocking, cruel. Some sounded like people I knew, my mother, my father, my grandfather. But they were all wrong, like a record being played at the wrong speed. I fired into the corn. Once, twice, 3 times. The whispers only grew louder. Something moved just beyond the stalks. A shape, a shadow, slipping between the rows. I couldn't see it, but I felt it watching me. Then, just behind me, a voice whispered right against my ear, "Come here, boy." I ran. I don't even remember getting inside, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was locking the doors, shoving furniture against them, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers continued outside, circling the house, drifting in and out like the wind. And then, just before dawn, they stopped. I sat in the living room, still clutching my rifle. My parents found me there when they woke up, pale and shaking. I didn't tell them what I saw. I didn't need to. My father took one look at me, then at the cornfield, and said, "We're leaving." And we did. Within a week, we packed up everything we owned and left that farm behind. I've never gone back, never set foot near a cornfield since. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, when the night is too quiet and the crickets go silent, I hear it. A voice, my grandfather's voice, call my name. And I know, deep in my bones, that if I ever answer, if I ever step too close to the corn again, I won't come back.